I've spoken much about the Avantone Planar. It is one of my favorite headphones. It is comfortable, robust, and as neutral a headphone as I have ever heard. There are two issues that might prevent people from seriously considering the Planar. First, the sub-bass roll-off. Second, the steep power requirement. There is nothing we can do for the latter, but there is something you can do for the Earpads. Avantone does not currently sell replacement Earpads for the Planar. It has only one kind, which is a velour-type material. The Planar's particular shape means you cannot easily find replacement Earpads even if you wanted to try. However, there is a very similar Earpad you can buy if you look hard enough. The now discontinued and mixed-reviewed Acoustic Research AR-H1 had Earpads in the same shape as that of the Planar. There are three variants of the H1 Earpads. There's the sheepskin, leatherette, and hybrid velour. I bought the sheepskin Earpads. In this video, you will see how easy it is to put the Earpads on the Planar, and we will briefly describe the sound alterations with the H1 Earpads. The Planar's Earpad system requires Velcro. There's Velcro on the driver housing and on the back of the stock Earpads. All you need to do is find a roll of standard Velcro. Avoid getting the heavy grip Velcro. That stuff has different thickness fibers that will not stick to the standard fibers on the Planar. It is merely a matter of cutting small pieces of Velcro and attaching them to the H1 Earpads. Try not to block the ear openings and keep the Velcro on the back flap of the leather. You can hot swap the stock and H1 Earpads to your heart's content. One thing you'll notice, however, is that the H1 Earpads do not fully cover the driver housing. There is a small portion that remains visible. Moreover, because the Planar does not have right and left indicators on the ear cups, you have to rely on the markings on the inside of the stock Earpads, and naturally, the H1 Earpads do not have this notification. Consequently, you will need to decide on a way to determine which ear cup is which. I used painter's tape. You can use whatever method you want as long as it makes sense to you. So, the only issue for me regarding the Planar sound signature is the sub-bass roll-off. I wanted to know if the H1 Earpads would fix this. I also wanted to know if there were other alterations, positive or negative, that were audible. In order to determine this, I plugged the Planar into my RME ADI2. I played music from Amazon Music HD. I hot-swapped Earpads and replayed songs. The following is my general impression of the alterations. Sub-bass rumble in Mountains by Hans Zimmer seemed to be marginally altered with the H1 Earpads. On the stock Earpads, the sub-bass was fast and sometimes recessed. It had fast transients. The combination of these two factors results in a fast sub-bass that does not jump out. On the H1 pads, the sub-bass increased by several decibels and the reverberation was slightly longer. There is an audible difference, though not an overwhelming one. The best example of this is when the crescendo hits. On the stock pads, the rolling thunder effect during the crescendo seemed more rolled off compared to what I heard on the H1 pads. Mid-bass slam was slightly harder with the H1 pads. In Conquer by Overwork, I heard a marginal increase in the snapping sound of the drumsticks. Bass transients was slightly slower with the H1 pads, which helped add a bit more emphasis to the bass overall. I listened to many tracks, both from my test playlist and my personal collection. I found that the bass was slightly more emphasized with the H1 Earpads. With this also came more melding between mid-bass and sub-bass. There was no distortion, however. The stock Earpads retain more bass clarity and detail compared to the H1 Earpads. Mids receive a similar alteration as to the bass. That is, it is not a drastic alteration, just a noticeable one. Female sibilance is slightly increased with the H1 Earpads. However, that sibilance is not harsh, at least not to me. It is below my personal pain threshold. Of more import is the extended reverberation of mid-centric instruments. Guitars, pianos, vocals, they all seem to meld together just a bit more than on the stock Earpads. Multiple vocalists are marginally more melded than on the stock Earpads. Indeed, on the stock Earpads, you can still hear multiple vocalists when all instruments play at peak volume. But on the H1 Earpads, backup vocalists become harder to distinguish. Treble, I think, gets the most obvious alteration in the frequency range. When I played Scherzo for X-Wings, Flight from the City, and Take 5 from my test playlist, I noticed more energy in treble instruments with the H1 Earpads. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the H1 Earpads boosted the brass and horns. This was not harsh or ear-piercing, but was noticeably more emphasis than what I heard on the stock Earpads. In Flight from the City, the piano sounded closer on the H1 pads. It was not as clear, its notes melded more than on the stock pads. The electric buzz effect was slightly muffled on the H1 pads as well. The cello sounded full, close to what the stock Earpads produced. However, on the H1 Earpads, the cello melded more so with the piano. In Take 5, the saxophone seemed to have a bit more energy on the H1 Earpads. The difference was not as significant as the horns and brass in Scherzo for X-Wings. Separation of instruments was slightly better on the stock Earpads. Indeed, the piano and drums tended to melt slightly more on the H1 Earpads. It appears that details become less obvious with the H1 Earpads. The difference sometimes is noticeable and sometimes not. It all depends on the particular sound and whether you're too caught up in the music. The H1 Earpads tend to muffle some details because of the thicker bass and longer decay of notes. This is neither good nor bad, simply a different effect than what you hear on the stock Earpads. Consequently, if details matter to you, then stock Earpads would be preferred. Try as I might, I really could not hear much soundstage difference between the two Earpads. If I had to be very picky, I would say that the stock Earpads have slightly more soundstage reproduction than what you get on the H1 Earpads. But one thing is sure, the H1 Earpads do not make the Planar a narrow-sounding headphone. Overall, there is a difference in sound. There's more instrument and vocal melding, longer reverberation, more treble energy, slightly emphasized sub-bass, and more loss of detail and a marginal reduction in clarity when you use the H1 Earpads. Is the Planar still a neutral headphone with the H1 Earpads installed? No, I'm afraid not. Although I think that the sub-bass is probably much closer to neutral on the H1 Earpads, the other alterations the Earpads make undermine that positive result. The extra treble energy and vocal sibilance kick the Planar out of true neutral territory. The sibilance is reminiscent of what I hear on the Allo S4 and S4R. However, it is less than what I hear on the Avantone MP1. The treble emphasis reminds me of the HD700. To test this, I pulled out my HD700 and plugged it into the RME, and of course, I volume matched. There is a huge difference in overall tonality between these two headphones. However, when speaking of treble energy only, I can say that the treble spike is similar to the spike on the HD700. The saving grace for the H1 Earpads is that they are nowhere near as peaky as the HD700. Mind you, I'm not saying that the H1 pads make the treble sound like the HD700. Instead, I am trying to convey the type of treble energy I hear. This is an imperfect example, I know, but hopefully you get the point I'm trying to make. And that point is this: treble is definitely affected with the H1 pads. So, I think the Planar's original stock configuration remains the most neutral I have heard of any headphone. The H1 Earpads make meaningful differences. There's nothing negative about what they do. Comfort is fantastic, construction is very good, and the alterations they make are not overwhelming. If you have the Planar and think it might be a little too boring, the H1 Earpads might do the trick.